quick message before we start. We hope our conversations open up new perspectives and new ideas for our listeners, and our goal is to be informative. But we want to emphasize that this isn't a substitute for individual therapy, and we're not providing medical or psychological advice here. If you feel moved by what you hear, and if you want to explore it more deeply, or if there's something in your life you'd like to work on, please reach out to an LGBTQ affirming therapist online or in your area. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to the Psych Out Podcast, where two psychology nerds get psyched up for LGBTQ affirming history, research, and practice. And now your hosts, Chris and Jen.
Welcome, everybody, to the Psych Out Podcast. I'm Chris, and with me, as always, is my good friend and co-host, Jen.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jen. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice who mostly works with LGBTQ people of all ages. Chris, tell us about who you are.
I'm a master's student studying clinical psychology and specializing in LGBTQ affirmative therapy.
How many quarters do you have left? You're almost not a master's student.
I am in that wonderful period in academic life where I am almost done with the coursework and then have other responsibilities that are probably going to take a few more quarters. I am almost done with my last class where you sit down and have homework for it.
Look, you got to celebrate every milestone. You got to take them seriously because
I'm going to let it rip when I'm done with that class.
Hell yeah.
That will be a celebration.
100%. I love it. I love it so much. Okay. What are we here to talk about today, Chris?
We want to talk about bisexuality. We've done a lot of good work so far in this, rough season of our podcast. If we're doing seasons, talking a lot about trans issues as they're so pertinent to our work, our studies, and to the world around us.
And ourselves personally.
Yeah, and ourselves personally. And we want to touch on another issue that's also relevant to us personally and really start to broaden out and look at other aspects of queer identities through a psychological lens, mix it up a little bit. So we thought bisexuality would be a great thing to do a couple episodes in a row on and just, establish how we want to talk about that going forward.
Yeah. I'm really excited about this. Chris and I just presented at a conference together, and I presented at that same conference for many years. And the first time that I presented, I did something specifically about bisexuality, and I had just dozens of people come up to me later and say, I thank you so much for doing that because I never see it talked about in these contexts in any specific way. It's always just sort of folded in, which is, problematic in a number of ways. And we'll get to that in just a minute. First, though, I think we want to define what we're talking about because choosing the term bisexuality is not it's not a given. It is a choice to use that term. I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that term because it sounds like it is talking about a gender binary, like male versus female or man versus woman, and bisexuality is I like both. But it actually, and the term has a long history and has been used in a lot of different ways that we'll get into. But in our sense, it's being attracted to one's own gender and other genders. It's an umbrella term, I think, that some people will accept as an umbrella term for other things like pansexual or fluid, or sometimes queer is used to mean the same thing. We don't know we've got umbrellas upon umbrellas upon umbrellas in this world.
And for some people, as you're touching on, for some people, existing under that umbrella and using that word with that history as an umbrella term, fits or it doesn't fit. A lot of different umbrellas.
The term I've seen in some of the academic literature is plurisexual, which is a lot to say.
It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue for me.
It doesn't. And I think, I talk a lot about terminology with people because a lot of times people will say why do labels even matter? Who cares about labels? But we need words in order to exist in community with each other. And words matter in terms of political efficacy too. It's hard to advocate for the rights of a group of people if you can't say who they are. And bisexual is the word that is the most known In fact, one of the sources that I'll talk about a couple of times probably is that I use for this is Shiri Eisner's Notes for a Bisexual Revolution. I don't know why I'm holding this up to the camera. This is a podcast, but y'all, it's a pink book with a fist saying "Bi Notes for a Bisexual Revolution," and like the entire point, right, is that we use the term politically as well as for identity, and I mean those two things are intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the next thing we wanted to talk about, because, well, actually, let me back up. Let's spend 1 minute on this. What, in the LGBTQ acronym, what group represents the largest portion of that community, Chris? Pop quiz.
I would say broadly defined that it's bisexuals.
Yes, indeed. Like that is, we are the majority of the LGBTQ community, and yet named very infrequently, specifically, and very specific, very sort of treated like gay light.
Yeah.
Like the Bud Light of queerness. So one of the things that comes from that, or at least partially comes from that, is that psychological outcomes for bisexual people are significantly worse than for lesbian and gay people.
Mm-hmm.
Significantly on levels of, both including things like levels of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, and also on levels of like vulnerability to sexual violence and domestic violence, like all of those things. Bisexual folks, both men and women and non-binary people, all have increased vulnerability to that. And I want to just sort of acknowledge that before we get into more of the conceptual stuff. We're going to come back around to that at the end because they're related.
If I can guess at what you want to talk about at the end, I think it's worth acknowledging, the way that, what we're engaging in, like this conversation of, language and labels and like, what do we call it and what does it mean to be, I think that is important work to do. And I also think it adds to the stress. I think it's a constant stress when you're engaging in queer community and your identity is like the topic of discussion, no matter how, that engagement is, no matter how it's intended, stressful.
Yeah. Being contested is stressful.
Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, there's a lot of that going on right now in popular culture around bisexuality, which we'll talk about on a different episode. So I wanted to talk a little bit. A lot of times we talk about like bi erasure or bi invisibility. That's a term that you hear a lot. And I will give you an example from my own life of being at like this really awesome drag show. And, the MC comes out and is like, "Where are all my gays at?" And like people shouted, "Yay!" And where are all my lesbians at? And people shouted, "Yay!" And then the show kept going. And I was like, but I want to shout.
Hello. You don't know until it's finished. Like, okay, am I going to have to shout early because I'm not going to get a chance to shout later, or do I hold off?
Exactly. That is exactly the thought process that I had. And that's an example of invisibility, right? And invisibility does more than just ignore. It also, like we said before, like wraps bisexuality up in the like blanket of gayness as if they are the same thing. And I think we have common political cause. And I also think that it is useful to address our experiences as separate experiences as well as common ones.
Yeah.
Right. But I also put hypervisible here. We talked about this before we started recording. There's this weird like combination of invisible and hypervisible. Hypervisible, what I mean by that is, like you were talking about contested identities. Like we get to be the subject of certain kinds of discourse in very uncomfortable and intense ways. An example that I have of that, I think, is people talking about, I don't want to date such and such a person because they're bi and they're going to cheat on me. Like they'll inevitably leave me for a man.
Yeah, I run into that one a lot.
And this is the experience of marginalization, I think, happens a lot. Like I think this is common in any kind of marginalized space, is that you're both like on the margins, so you're ignored, and also you're being pushed to the margins, so you're actively being seen at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that uncomfortable position for very marginalized people where you're simultaneously like both like very impactful and powerful in some ways where you have to be discussed because like what does this represent? What does this mean that people behave this way or have these views? While also being very like weak because like oh no they're that's outside of the mainstream, that's like we don't have to account for that and we shouldn't spend too much attention on it. It's like
Right.
having it both ways in a way that's extremely uncomfortable.
It is. It's holding any contradiction inside of our sense of ourselves is uncomfortable. So let's talk about bisexuality specifically. What makes it uncomfortable? What do we think bisexuality presents conceptually to our culture that makes it a contested identity, an identity that people both try to ignore and spend a lot of energy trying to delegitimize? What is it about being bisexual? What's wrong with me is my question, Chris.
What's wrong with me? Well, let me tell you, what's wrong with me is what's wrong with you. Like I was just talking about earlier, I think there's a lot of that notion of like, this is a transitional identity that's like going to coalesce, and that if you're in a monogamous relationship with someone, you as a bisexual person are gonna like one day like land one way or the other. You're gonna be fully homosexual, fully heterosexual, and that could have vast consequences for whatever current monogamous relationship you're in, presuming that person is one or the other.
Right. You've picked a team.
Yeah, picking a team. That's another one of those like modes of thinking that people have that lead to like stereotyping of or like marginalizing, like the idea that bisexual people have to pick a team, and because they haven't done so yet, that is something to be judged or feared.
Yeah. Look, you're pro Yankees or you're anti Yankees, okay? That's just how it goes.
Exactly. Where, if the Yankees are playing the Dodgers, I'm very pro Yankees all of a sudden.
Oh, no, Chris. I don't want to know that about you. No, go Dodgers. Okay. I've known you so long. How did I not know this? No. That's it. Our friendship is over.
Over.
Over and done. Okay.
This is the LA San Francisco rift happening.
Oh no, yes. Well, we didn't talk about the Giants. Wow, off topic, but fun. So there's actually like there's a background to this that I think people don't actually know. Like this idea that bisexuality is like you haven't picked a team yet actually comes in some ways very much from psychology. And like specifically from the way that psychoanalysts, and hey, who's our favorite psychoanalyst? Freud. Freud. We need like a special da 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 da. Freud's in the house.
Yeah, we need a Freud sound effect for the
We got Freud in the house. So Freud thought of all people as being, and this is the translation that's used for this term, polymorphously perverse, which I actually love that. That feels like something to aspire to. But polymorphously perverse, which means that as we are born, we are not born with a very specific fixed sexual orientation from Freud's point of view.
We being people in general.
Humans, yes, humans, all we. I don't know, maybe animals too, but mostly humans.
Like as opposed to like bisexuals as a people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Good point.
As a people, so, as a category.
As a category. So we are all born polymorphously perverse. And then we eventually are socialized into monosexuality, and specifically socialized into heterosexuality. And it's a weird contradiction because Freud was also one of the few like early psychoanalysts who was very, very much on the side of you cannot change sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. So bit of a contradiction there, I think. But the idea was it gets fixed eventually, right? Like, and I mean fixed in a double way. It gets fixed in the sense that it gets solidified, and it gets fixed in the sense that the problem of polymorphous perversity gets solved by human maturation and socialization from Freud's point of view.
Right, which
Right.
brings in the idea that if you are properly socialized, you will obviously reach a solid end state of binary.
Yeah, a binary of heterosexuality, of domestic-sized heterosexuality, wherein you are monogamous and reproducing, right? This has also some relationships to the way that Darwinism sort of developed its idea of gender. So if you look at the way that gender was understood, well, actually, really sex was understood, say in the Middle Ages, and this is a vast this is a broad brush that I'm painting things with, okay? But like one broad brush you could paint with is that they didn't talk as much about male and female physiologically being opposites. They talked more about female being like an incomplete male, like a failed male, failed to thrive, right? Failed to launch male.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a lot.
Right. Yeah. Not a better model than what we have now, right? No. And again, like not universal, but that is one way that it was seen. And when Darwin's theory started to circulate, it became the idea of dimorphism, sexual dimorphism, became much more important to the idea of like the perpetuation of species, right? And so they also looked at fetal development, wherein for the first, like, I think month or two of fetal development, there is not observable sexual dimorphism.
Right.
We do not have events and obvious sex in the womb until later in fetal development.
Right.
Okay. Follow me here. This became a model that was also placed on top of our idea both of individual human development after birth. So you were born and now you're reflecting that embryonic stage of development where you're not dimorphic yet.
Right.
And cultural development. So the idea that like primitive, I'm using air quotes here, people who can't see me, primitive cultures are somehow like more sexually fluid, both in gender and in sexual attraction, and more developed civilizations have now like created that monosexuality and monogamy and heterosexuality.
Right.
So bisexuality then becomes both infantile and primitive. Right. And that stamp of infantilism and lack of development is then imprinted on the way we think about bisexuality even to today.
Yeah.
That's one model. One model of bisexuality being challenging or problematic to like mainstream culture is the idea that it's like immature or underdeveloped.
Right.
And messy.
And that it's more prone to change than other sexualities.
Exactly.
At LGBTQ Evolutions, we know that change starts with people like you. Every act of kindness, every dollar, and every moment of your time brings us closer to removing the barriers that prevent our friends and family from being themselves. Together, we can create a brighter, more compassionate future for our community. Donate today with the link below.
So that's one model of how bisexuality ends up getting conceptualized culturally. And that flows into a lot of psychological like studies of sexual orientation. So, for instance, you end up with a lot of studies where bisexuals or people who just reported a history of having sex with multiple genders are just not included in research because it's too messy. It messes up the data. Right? Yeah. It's like if you want to study depression and then you have a bunch of people who come into your trial who have both depression and anxiety and you say, never mind, like the anxious ones, let's just not, we just want to study pure depression. So we just want to study pure homosexuality.
Right. That happens so often. It's something to always keep in mind. Like we've done other episodes of like how to read scientific studies. And when you read the process of like how people are selected for those studies, an awful lot of times it's like, let's look at the very small cohort of people who are only depressed. I mean, maybe that's not that small.
No, I think it's very small.
right? Yeah, it
Right.
feels
I think
very
it's
small.
very small. It's taking humanity and human experience and trying to like make it simple in a way that it isn't.
Yeah.
Which is the other issue, the other conceptual framework for why bisexuality can be upsetting or stirs things up. And that is, instead of having a movement politically where we add to the acceptable status of heterosexual, homosexual, we have two statuses that are acceptable. One way of framing bisexuality is, let's just not have either. Let's just be who we are. Let's be fluid. We don't
Yeah.
need a straight box and a gay box and to give like a stamp of approval to both of those boxes. We can live outside of those boxes.
Yeah. And I mean, you see the suggestion of that even in like early modern like definitions of bisexuality in like the Western literature. I'm just trying to come up with a good phrase to situate Kinsey, who we haven't really talked about yet. Like the
1950s.
Yeah, they comes up even as early as the 1950s, where Kinsey has his scale, and as he continues to work with it, eventually he lands on this idea of like, okay, like you have your position on this scale, you're more homosexual or more heterosexual, or you're somewhere in the middle, and that means you're bisexual. But this identity, is probably only going to define you for a matter of years. Like you should retake this and reevaluate yourself on this scale every few years. Like even in the 1950s, you have some of these ideas that are really challenging the idea that this is that bisexuality could be a useful like stopping point of like, okay, we have three orientations. We have three.
That it's an identity in and of itself is not like, and Alfred Kinsey was a really, really prominent researcher into sex and sexuality at a time when very few people were actually really doing that work, and created a scale of sexual orientation that was one of the first times that we really thought about the idea that there might be something other than straight and gay, but it positioned straightness and gayness as opposites or binaries on a scale, and bisexuality as being what's in between them and not as its own thing. It was like literally physically situated in between the two, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the idea here too, is that bisexuality is not a thing in and of itself. It's just an exploding of categories. Right? Which is really threatening. And actually, I'll give you an example. Hopefully I'm going to be able to have a conversation about this with a colleague that we can put on the podcast too later. But there have been a lot of, there's been a lot of discourse. Our favorite thing is discourse online about various celebrities who were taken to be lesbian and then started to date men. And one of the sort of pushbacks that my friend shared with me were lesbians who came out and said, we are offended by the idea of saying that sexuality is fluid. And also, I know that these people do not represent all lesbians, but this is what several people were saying. And bisexuality can be framed as merely the idea that sexuality is fluid, that it's not fixed, right? Which is very true for some people and not for everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, we see that in the way that like Kinsey eventually came to view that as a completely uncontroversial statement, and that it is proceeded to be extremely controversial ever since.
Yes.
And it predates him, but like he's really trying to get into the weeds and like, okay, what can we definitively say about this as scholars? This feels like something that's very true and people will understand, and it's still an open question.
Exactly. So you can see like these are slightly different models, right? That bisexuality is an undifferentiated state prior to maturing into heterosexuality, versus bisexuality is just a blowing up of those categories in general. It makes the categories meaningless because it states that sexuality is inherently fluid. So we have those two models, and you can see that let's just start. Let's name some of the stereotypes that are out there about bisexuals? What stereotypes have you encountered about bisexual people?
The stereotype that bisexuals and especially pansexuals like are hypersexual, like
Yes.
they will and do sleep with anyone because attraction is such a core part of like their sexuality, because they have more attraction than other people, and then
Right.
that leads
Right.
to more sex.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I mean, I've seen that of like, well, if I'm in a long-term relationship with someone who's bi, aren't they eventually going to want to sleep with someone who has different genitals? Like,
Right, exactly.
which I want to say, don't worry, we can make up for that. But that's definitely one. And you'll see like movies and TV shows where the way that it becomes clear that someone is bi is because they go and cheat.
Right.
Right. Yeah. There's also, and this came out, this was a big deal in the 1980s, but has been sort of all along, is that bisexual people are somehow vectors of disease. And some of this came from like the AIDS crisis in the 80s, where you would have like bisexual men who were sleeping with men and then going home to their wives, and the fear that they are therefore spreading AIDS into the straight population, which is when we start caring about it, right? So that came, and then also the idea, which by the way, like there's an idea in lesbian culture sometimes that lesbians don't need to worry about sexually transmitted diseases because none of them are sleeping with men, which is not true, first of all.
A, wrong, and B.
Wrong. And B, the idea that bisexuals therefore are sort of like bringing into the pool like icky stuff that wouldn't be in the pool if there were no bisexuals there. So there's the idea of bisexuals as a vector of disease.
Right.
And I think you can see, so in both of those, right, the idea of like a promiscuous bisexual, you can trace back to that idea of polymorphous perversity, right? The idea of like, well, your sexuality is just going in all of these different directions and it has yet to be conditioned into one controllable specific role, right? And so you can see that fear going all the way back to that idea. Or this person is not going to fulfill their role in society by pairing up with another person and reproducing, right? They're going to undermine those things by going out and cheating on people. And you can also, in the idea of vector of disease, go back to that sort of Darwinian idea of the cultural Darwinism that was not what Darwin was all about, but what people took Darwin to be about, of like,
right,
these are the primitives in the tropics where there are strange diseases, and those strange diseases are going to be taken into white culture and pollute all of, right? Like it's in line with that.
That's such a good point, and such a prominent way in which AIDS was discussed and continues to be discussed.
Very much so. Very much so. So you can see those historical roots of the way that we even define or understand these terms in these modern day stereotypes, right? And I think the other like way that you see that is the idea that bisexual people are confused, right? Like just don't quite understand themselves. Right, coming from the idea that bisexuality explodes categories, that like we've made sexuality incoherent by messing with the fixed categories by which we were defining sexuality. And if we are doing that, that probably means we are internally incoherent.
Yeah. So it's such an odd process of like thinking through these stereotypes. Is like that makes sense to me when you explain it. It's like, oh, I see how people get there. And it's like, but it's still like just terrible reasoning.
Well, I mean, but that's the thing, right? In terms of the way that we understand each other. And this is why, this podcast is very much like psychology and history woven together, right? Our way of looking at the world is layers after layers after layers after layers of like historical ideas that have been like piled into our culture and inculcated into our brains.
Yeah.
Right. Like we can trace a lot of the things that we think we came up with in our own minds to things that people have been saying for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And also on the psychology front, like, layers and layers and layers of abstraction and, people looking for shortcuts that let them like quickly react to an idea, quickly affirm their values when their values are challenged by someone else, to, reaffirm our self-esteem. It's layers and layers of shortcuts in how we see the world and what complexity we're willing to accept, and when and under what circumstances we're willing to reconsider our prior assumptions. So when I say that's terrible, terrible reasoning, it strikes me as terrible, terrible reasoning because I've had a lot of necessity in my life to examine this stuff and think about it, because it feels like that's my reaction to the stress and the anxiety of being a queer person is I intellectualize, I jump in, I'm I need to think about this stuff a lot so that when I'm challenged, I have something meaningful to say. So that's why it strikes me as terrible reasoning. If you're not in if you're not in a situation where you react to stress the way some people like myself react to stress, it's not that it's inherently terrible reasoning. That's just the shortcut that you take. And we all as human beings take shortcuts in order to operate in such a world of complexity where the complexity is ever increasing.
100%. And I think that goes back to the idea that bisexuality feels threatening because it makes our idea of sexuality more complex. And we have pretty much universally, I want to say universally, but I always stop myself, a cognitive resistance to complexity because our brains are really friggin' busy.
Mm-hmm.
They're really busy. So that is part of what happens is we've got this one way of looking at queer identity. And if we start paying attention to the majority of people in our community who don't actually fit into the one vision that we have, Sherry Eisner calls the LGBTQ movement the GGGG movement, that it is essentially the gay movement. That paying attention to bisexuality does mean having to rethink some of the ways that we conceptualize queerness and some of the political approaches that we have, where instead of just trying to add an extra category of okay, we are in a sense saying maybe we don't need to have categories of okay. Maybe we can just be okay.
Yeah, maybe we should start from an assumption that natural human variation around attraction and relationship dynamics and social roles, maybe we can start from the presumption that those things are okay because they vary a lot.
And that is really hard. Yeah. And I think recognizing how rooted all of these thoughts are in very old ways of ranking the value of human beings, of assuming a certain social endpoint for people, that is, you're valuable because you produce in the sense of reproducing and also creating capital, that really considering bisexuality and taking bisexuality seriously gives you an avenue to really evaluate all of those ways of making hierarchies out of people.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
All right. Anything you want to add to our conversation? We're going to have a couple more episodes. We've got a great interview that we're going to have a couple interviews coming up. So we've got some more time to talk about this. But anything you want to add now?
I have so many more thoughts, but I feel like where we're landing right now puts a really good bow on, the themes we've been talking about of definition of, what makes this a challenging concept and, how that challenge, feeds into stereotypes and the shortcuts that we all take in, trying to ensure our own comfort.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope everybody is staying safe out there during really difficult times. And I look forward to having more of this conversation about a very under-addressed topic in the queer community.
Absolutely. Jen, I'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
You've been listening to the Psych Out podcast. For more information on today's subject, information about our charity, or to find our Patreon, check the links below. Join us next time to learn more about the psychology of who we are.
These are difficult difficult times. We know that some of you out there are suffering so much that you might be thinking of ending your life. If you're having thoughts of suicide, please reach out to professionals for help. You can go to an emergency room, call 911, or reach out to the hotlines we have linked in this description below. I know that many of us have had bad experiences in medical settings, but there are people, many people in this field who want you to live. Please reach out for help so that you can find them. We want you around for our next talk.